The wind bit at Louise's face as he shuffled down the quiet streets of Holland, Michigan, a plastic grocery bag dangling from his hand, its contents as uninspired as the life he now led. At 55, he'd weathered storms before. His mother's death to cancer had left a scar that took years to fade, but nothing had prepared him for the swift, brutal loss of Aurora, his wife of decades. She'd been the heartbeat of their home, a woman whose laughter could chase away the gloomiest Michigan winter, and whose cooking turned simple ingredients into feasts that warmed the soul. When an aggressive cancer sank its claws into her, it gave no quarter. In mere months, she was gone, leaving Louise adrift in a world stripped of color. The house they'd shared, once alive with her presence, became a mausoleum of memories. Her favorite armchair empty, the kitchen silent, the bed too vast for one. Days melted into one another, each a gray smear of routine. He'd sit before the television, its drone a hollow companion, watching shows he didn't care about, their plots as meaningless as the hours they filled. He ventured out only for groceries, a mechanical task to keep his body moving while his spirit sank deeper into a mire of despair. Aurora had been his anchor, his perfect companion, the woman who made every moment special with her gentle touch and radiant smile. Without her, life wasn't living. It was enduring, a sentence he served in solitude, deafened by the silence she'd left behind. On one such afternoon, the cold nipped at his fingers as he trudged home, the sky a heavy quilt of clouds promising snow. His breath puffed in small clouds, his mind lost in the fog of memory. Aurora's voice calling him to dinner, her hand brushing his as they walked these same streets. The grocery bag swung lightly, a meager haul of canned soup and bread, when a sound pierced the stillness, a faint, pitiful whimper. Louise slowed, his eyes drifting to a soggy cardboard box slumped beside a dumpster, in an alley he'd passed 100 times without notice. He might have kept walking, his life had no room for detours, but the sound tugged at something buried beneath his grief, a flicker of curiosity or perhaps pity. He stepped closer, peering into the box, and there it was, a puppy, so small and frail it seemed more shadow than substance, its fur matted with filth, its body trembling against the chill. Its eyes, dulled by hunger and cold, met his, and for a moment Louise froze. He glanced around the alley, half expecting someone to claim it, but the street was empty. Someone had abandoned this creature, left it to fade into the trash like something disposable. Louise had never been an animal person. He and Aurora had built their life without pets, content in their quiet order. Dogs were messy, noisy, a disruption he'd never craved. Yet as the puppy's weak gaze held his, something stirred. A pang he couldn't name, a pull he couldn't ignore. Hesitantly, he set the groceries down and reached in, his hands awkward as they lifted the shivering bundle. It weighed almost nothing, a fragile scrap of life, and he tucked it inside his jacket, its faint warmth seeping through his shirt. He told himself it was temporary. He'd take it home, clean it up, feed it, then drop it at a shelter. That was the rational plan, the kind of decision Aurora would have nodded at with her practical smile. He picked up his bag and headed home, the puppy's shallow breaths a strange rhythm against his chest, a heartbeat where his own felt still. The house greeted him with its usual silence, broken only by the rustle of his jacket as he set the puppy on the kitchen floor. It wobbled, too weak to stand properly, and Louise rummaged through the cabinets for something, anything, to give it. He settled on a bowl of water and a slice of bread softened with milk, watching as the little thing lapped at it with desperate, clumsy effort. He sat back, arms crossed, telling himself this was a one-night obligation. But as the hours passed, the puppy's presence grew louder, not in sound, but in the way it shifted the air. It whimpered when he left the room, its eyes tracking him with an intensity that unnerved him. By morning, it had gained enough strength to totter after him, leaving a trail of chaos, a chewed sock, a puddle on the tile, a yip that startled him from his chair. Louise's frustration flared. He hadn't signed up for this. His life was already a wreckage, a hollow shell of what it had been with Aurora, and now this creature was piling disorder onto his pain. He shouted at it to stop, to sit, to be still, but it ignored him, darting under the table with a burst of energy he envied. The house, once a tomb of quiet, now rang with barks and skittering paws, a cacophony that grated on his nerves. He sank into the couch, rubbing his temples, wondering why he'd bothered, why he hadn't left it by that dumpster to its fate. Yet, as the days blurred into a week, something strange crept into the chaos. The puppy's ribs grew less stark, its coat less dull, and Louise found himself watching it, not just with irritation, but with a quiet fascination. It wasn't the companion he'd imagined. It was loud, messy, everything he'd avoided. But those eyes, those persistent, searching eyes, held something he couldn't shake. They followed him as he moved through the house, sat with him as he stared at the TV, met his gaze when he muttered about Aurora under his breath. He began to talk to it, gruff at first. "You're a damn nuisance, you know that?" Then softer, about the weather, about the emptiness that gnawed at him. It didn't answer, of course, but it listened, head tilted, as if it understood. The pain of Aurora's loss didn't vanish, but it shifted, a weight that grew lighter in the presence of this unexpected intruder. Louise didn't know it yet, but a crack had formed in the wall he'd built around his heart. A crack widened by a creature he'd never wanted, a spark of life in a world he'd thought dead. The puppy had wormed its way into Louise's life, a stubborn little force that refused to be ignored. And as the days stretched into weeks, he realized it needed a name, something more than "you" or "hey" grumbled in moments of exasperation. He watched it one evening, sprawled on the living room rug, its tiny chest rising and falling as rain drummed against the windows, a steady rhythm that mirrored the storm still raging in his soul. The name came to him like a whisper from somewhere deep. Noah. It felt right, resonant, a nod to the biblical figure who'd braved a flood to shepherd life into a new dawn. This scrappy creature, with its matted fur now softening and its eyes growing brighter, seemed to be doing the same for him, carrying him through the deluge of grief that had drowned his days since Aurora's death. Noah wasn't just surviving, he was tugging Louise along, a makeshift ark in a sea of loss. And though he didn't fully grasp it yet, that name marked the beginning of something he couldn't turn back from. He muttered it aloud, "Noah," and the puppy's ears twitched, its head lifting as if it recognized the sound, sealing the bond in a way Louise hadn't expected. Life with Noah was anything but smooth. The dog was a tornado of energy, a stark contrast to the stillness Louise had cloaked himself in since Aurora's passing. He bounded through the house with reckless abandon, knocking over a vase she'd loved, a delicate thing with painted roses that shattered into a dozen pieces on the hardwood floor. Louise cursed, sweeping up the shards, his chest tightening at the loss of another piece of her. But Noah only barked, undeterred, darting under the couch to chew a slipper he'd dragged from the bedroom. Muddy paw prints streaked the tiles Aurora had kept pristine, and every attempt to train him, sit, stay, anything, ended in failure, Noah's tail wagging like a metronome of defiance. Louise's frustration simmered. He'd wanted peace, not this chaos. And some days he wondered if he should have stuck to his plan and handed Noah off to a shelter. But then there were the quieter moments, the ones that crept in unannounced. Noah curling up beside him on the couch, his warmth a small comfort against the chill of an empty house, or the way he'd sit at Louise's feet, head tilted, as if waiting for something. Louise started talking to him, gruffly at first, about the groceries he'd forgotten or the cold snap coming in, but soon it was more, "Aurora would have laughed at you, you know, making a mess like that," or "she'd have known what to do with you, not like me." Noah didn't reply, but those steady eyes held his, and in them, Louise found a listener where there'd been none, a presence that softened the edges of his loneliness. The pain of Aurora's absence didn't vanish. It was still a knife in his gut, but it dulled, softened by the rhythm of Noah's breaths, the patter of his paws on the floor, the small joys that began to stitch Louise back together, thread by fragile thread. Then came the day that tore it all apart, a day so bright and crisp it seemed to mock the fragility of the life Louise had begun to rebuild. The sun hung high, casting golden light over Holland's sidewalks, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves as he and Noah strolled together, a routine that had become his lifeline. Noah trotted ahead, leash loose in Louise's hand, his gait stronger now, his spirit unbroken despite the chaos he'd brought. They reached a crosswalk, a familiar stretch of pavement they'd crossed a dozen times, and Louise paused, glancing at the car that slowed to let them pass. He nodded a thanks, checked both ways, a habit Aurora had drilled into him, and stepped forward, Noah just a pace ahead, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. The world shifted in an instant. A roar shattered the quiet, two engines screaming as a pair of cars burst from behind the stopped vehicle, speeding recklessly, their drivers lost in some foolish race. Time stretched, each second a slow-motion nightmare. Louise saw the headlights, the blur of metal, and his voice ripped from his throat. Noah! He yanked the leash, desperate to pull him back, but it was too late. A sickening thud echoed, a brutal collision, as the first car struck Noah full on, the leash snapping with a violent jerk that sent Louise airborne. His body twisted, lifted, the world spinning as he crashed to the pavement, his head slamming against the curb with a crack that drowned out his scream. Pain flared, then faded, swallowed by a darkness that rushed in, deep and absolute, pulling him under as Noah's broken form blurred into the void. Darkness enveloped Louise, a vast, weightless void where time and pain dissolved, leaving him suspended in an emptiness that felt both infinite and intimate. His body was gone. No ache from the crash, no sting of the pavement against his skull. Just a quiet drift, as if he'd slipped free of the world's grasp. Then a warmth stirred, faint at first, like a candle flickering in the distance, growing until it bloomed within him, a light not from above, but from some deep well inside his soul. Shadows softened, shapes emerged, and there before him stood a figure cloaked in radiance, an aura of peace so pure it seemed to hum in the air. Jesus. His presence was undeniable, not in the stern judgment Louise had half expected from years of half-remembered sermons, but in a gentleness that wrapped around him like a long-lost embrace. His eyes, deep in knowing, met Louise's, and a voice spoke, soft yet resonant, cutting through the silence. Louise, do not fear. You are here for a reason greater than you can imagine. The words washed over him, melting the terror that had clung to him since the crash, replacing it with a stillness he'd never known, a peace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. He wanted to speak, to ask where he was, what had happened to Noah, but his voice stayed locked in his throat, held by the weight of the moment, the overwhelming sense that he stood on the edge of something vast. Jesus stepped closer, his gaze piercing yet tender, and spoke again, as if reading the questions Louise couldn't voice. That day you found Noah, it wasn't chance, he was sent to you. The words struck like a bell, reverberating through Louise's mind, pulling him back to that cold alley, the soggy box, the trembling puppy he'd almost left behind. He saw it again. Noah's dulled eyes, his frail body reduced to skin and bones, a mirror of the brokenness Louise had carried since Aurora's death. You saved each other, Jesus continued, his voice steady, certain. His suffering was yours, his confusion yours, but you chose one another. Tears welled in Louise's eyes, spilling over as the truth unfurled. Noah hadn't just stumbled into his life to fill a void. He'd been a lifeline, pulling him from the abyss when he'd been too lost to reach for it himself. Jesus smiled, a faint curve of his lips that held a world of understanding. Animals are more than companions, Louise. They are gifts from tools of love and healing sent when a man loses his way. The words sank deep, rewriting everything Louise had thought he knew. He'd seen Noah as a burden, then a comfort, but never this, a divine purpose woven into his chaos, a spark of grace in his darkest hour. His chest tightened, a flood of gratitude and awe threatening to overwhelm him, and a question burned through the haze. Will I see him again? Is he gone forever? Jesus nodded as if he'd been waiting for it, and his voice took on a cadence that felt ancient, eternal. Is it not written, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God? Louise recognized the echo of Scripture. Romans, a passage he had heard but never truly grasped until now. Before he could respond, the void shifted and a vision unfolded. Endless meadows stretched beneath a sky of crystal blue, rivers glinting like silvered threads, and across the expanse animals roamed, wolves beside lambs, lions resting with children, horses galloping through golden fields. And there, among them, was Noah, strong and whole, his fur gleaming, his eyes alight with a joy that radiated through the scene. He bounded forward, searching, waiting, and Louise knew it was for him. Love is eternal, Jesus said, his voice a promise. Nothing loved is lost in my kingdom. Noah will be there, just as all those who have loved with a pure heart. Tears streamed down Louise's face, a release of fear and a flood of hope. The certainty that their bond transcended the crash, the pain, the fragility of life. Jesus' gaze softened further, and he added, when you return, tell others what you've seen. The world has forgotten the value of God's creatures. Remind them that every bond of love is a sacred gift. The light began to fade, pulling back like a tide, and Louise felt a tug, a draw toward his body, the real world sharpening at the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw was Jesus' outstretched hand, a gesture of blessing, before the darkness rushed back, softer now, carrying him home. He awoke to a jagged reality. Pain seared through his skull, his limbs heavy against the pavement, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the distant wail of sirens. His eyes fluttered open, blurry at first, then focused on a sight that clenched his heart. Noah sprawled on the asphalt, his body broken, his breath shallow and ragged. Blood stained his fur, a stark red against the gray, but in his eyes, dim yet defiant, a spark flickered, a will to fight. Louise's breath hitched, his voice a broken whisper. Noah, hold on. The vision lingered in his mind, Jesus' words, Noah's radiant form in that promised land, and it anchored him, a lifeline amid the wreckage. He reached out, his hand trembling, brushing Noah's fur as the world spun and strangers' voices closed in, pulling him back to the fight for both their lives. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair, a sterile haze that clung to Louise as he lay in a bed too stiff, too cold, his body a map of bruises and fractures screaming with every breath. His head throbbed, a dull pulse from where it had struck the curb, but the pain in his chest was sharper, a vice that tightened with every thought of Noah. The last image burned in his mind, Noah's broken body on the asphalt, blood matting his fur, those eyes still flickering with life, haunted him through the peat of sedatives and the drone of machines. Doctors came and went, their voices a blur of jargon about concussions and cracked ribs. But Louise's questions cut through. Where's my dog? Is he alive? They hesitated, their faces tight, and finally one said Noah was at a veterinary clinic, condition critical, odds slim. The words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last, and Louise turned his face to the wall, tears stinging as he whispered into the sterile air, God, you sent him to me, don't take him now. The vision from that otherworldly place lingered, Jesus' promise, Noah waiting in a land of endless meadows, but it felt distant, fragile against the reality of tubes and bandages and the fear that he'd lose the one thing that had pulled him from the dark. Days bled into nights, a cycle of fitful sleep and waking dread, until a nurse brought news. Noah was still fighting, teetering on the edge, and Louise clung to that thread, praying with a fervor he hadn't known he possessed, begging for a miracle he wasn't sure he deserved. Weeks later, when his own body had mended enough to leave the hospital, Louise went straight to the clinic. His steps unsteady, but driven by a need that outweighed the pain. The vet led him to a small room, dim and quiet, where Noah lay in a crate, a patchwork of stitches and shaved fur, his legs splinted, his breathing a shallow rasp. Louise sank to his knees, his hand trembling, as he reached through the bars, brushing Noah's muzzle. Hey, buddy, he choked out, and then it happened. Noah's eyes opened, weak and clouded, searching until they found him. A faint wag of his tail, barely a twitch, but it was enough. Their gazes locked, and a surge of relief crashed through Louise, a tide that swept away the dread and left him sobbing. You did it, Noah. We made it. The vet warned him it would be a long road, months of care, therapy, no guarantees. But to Louise, it was already a victory, a testament to the bond Jesus had called eternal. He took Noah home, setting up a corner with blankets and bowls, and threw himself into the task with a patience he'd never known he had, feeding him by hand, carrying him outside, whispering encouragement through the nights when whimpers of pain broke the silence. Their healing became a shared journey, Noah's body knitting itself back together as Louise's spirit did the same. Each small step, Noah's first wobbly stand, his first bark, a triumph that stitched them closer, a lifeline forged in the wreckage of that terrible day. Years slipped by, marked by the slow rhythm of recovery and the quiet joys that filled the spaces grief had hollowed out. Noah bore the scars of the accident, his gait uneven, his fur patchy where it never grew back, but his spirit shone brighter, a resilience that mirrored Louise's own. He'd follow Louise everywhere, a shadow of loyalty, curling up beside him on the couch or waiting by the door with a patience that spoke of trust. The house, once a mausoleum, hummed with life again. Not the life Aurora had given it, but a new one built on muddy paw prints and the soft thud of a wagging tail. Then came the morning that Louise had dreaded, the one he'd known would come but hoped to push further into the future. Noah had grown old, his muzzle gray, his steps slower, his eyes clouding with age, yet he'd never wavered, always there, a constant in a world that kept turning. They were in the yard, the sun warm on their backs, when Noah stopped mid-step, his body swaying. He turned to Louise, those familiar eyes locking with his, and with a trembling effort, he wagged his tail, took a few faltering steps, and collapsed. Louise dropped to his knees, tears spilling as he cradled Noah's head. "Hey, my friend, I'm here," he whispered. And Noah looked up, his gaze a tapestry of love, gratitude, and a quiet sorrow that said goodbye. "I love you, Noah. Thank you for everything." With one last flicker of his tail, a faint echo of the energy he'd once had, Noah's eyes closed, his body stilled, and Louise felt the weight of his passing like a wave, crashing over him, leaving him breathless. He held Noah close, face buried in his fur, tears soaking the gray strands, the pain raw and overwhelming, yet softened by a peace that settled deep, Jesus' words ringing true. Nothing loved is lost. The morning after Noah's passing, Louise woke to a silence that pressed against his chest, heavier than any he'd known since Aurora's death. His eyes drifted to the empty spot by the bed where Noah had slept, a hollow space that echoed the void now carved in his heart. He moved through the house like a ghost, the absence of muddy paw prints and the soft clatter of a wagging tail amplifying the stillness, each corner a reminder of the companion who'd filled his days with purpose. Yet amid the grief, something lingered, a warmth, a presence that wasn't gone, woven into the memories of Noah's steady gaze, his quiet loyalty, the way he'd rested his muzzle on Louise's hand in the darkest nights. The vision from that near-death moment, Jesus' voice promising a reunion in a land of endless meadows, held him like an anchor, keeping him from sinking back into the despair that had once consumed him. He knelt by Noah's blanket, running his fingers over the worn fabric, and whispered, "I'll see you again, buddy." The words a vow as much as a comfort, a thread of hope that tied him to the promise of eternity. But as the days stretched into weeks, that promise grew into something more. A fire, a calling that burned within him, born of the truth Jesus had laid bare. Noah hadn't been just a dog, but a divine gift, a seal of help sent when Louise had lost his way. And that truth wasn't his alone to keep. He couldn't stay silent, not when he'd seen with his own eyes the sacred role animals played in God's design, a role the world had forgotten or dismissed. Noah had been his salvation, a spark of light in a life gone gray, and how many others had their own Noahs, creatures who'd loved them through pain, who'd stood by them when no one else could, without recognizing the hand of God behind it. Louise began to speak, first to neighbors over coffee, then to strangers at the park where he and Noah had walked, his voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with every telling. He shared the story, the dumpster where he'd found Noah, the chaos that turned to comfort, the accident that nearly took them both, and the vision that changed everything. "Animals aren't just pets," he'd say, his eyes bright with conviction. "They're gifts from Charsina, sent to heal us, to teach us love when we've forgotten how. Jesus showed me that." Well, some nodded, moved by the rawness of his words. Others shrugged, skeptical. But Louise pressed on, driven by the charge Jesus had given him. "Tell others what you've seen." He started writing too, pouring his heart into pages that spread beyond Holland, letters, articles, a small book that found its way into hands he'd never meet. The Bible backed him up, he'd point out, Quoting Romans, where creation itself groaned for redemption, a promise that every life, human or animal, mattered to the one who made it. Noah's life had mattered, had saved his, and Louise wanted the world to see that in the wag of a tail, the nudge of a nose, there was a love too pure to be chance. His message took root, a quiet ripple that grew as people shared their own stories, of dogs who'd sat by them through illness, cats who'd comforted them in loss, horses who'd carried them through grief. Louise listened, tears in his eyes, seeing Noah in every tale, proof that God's hand reached through his creatures to touch the broken. If you've loved an animal, he'd tell them, they'll be with you again. Jesus promised me that, in his kingdom, nothing loved is lost. He urged them to look closer, to see the signs they might have missed, the loyalty in a pet's eyes, the silent companionship that spoke louder than words, and to honor it as sacred. If you're lost, look for your Noah, he'd say, his voice soft but firm. Maybe they're waiting for you just like he waited for me. For those who felt the emptiness he'd once known, he offered hope. Your sign might still come. There's a creature out there who needs you as much as you need them. Yes, his words weren't just comfort. They were a call to cherish God's creatures, to protect them, to recognize the divine thread that bound them to us. He thought of Noah's suffering, abandoned, hit by that car, enduring pain no creature should, and saw it as a reflection of a fallen world, a world Jesus had promised to restore, where wolves would lie with lambs and Noah would run free, waiting for him. That hope fueled him, a light that shone through the gray days, a certainty that their bond wasn't broken, only paused. Today, Louise lives with that certainty, his life quieter now but rich with purpose. Noah's spot remains empty, but his spirit fills the house. In the memories of their walks, the echo of his bark, the peace that settles over Louise when he closes his eyes and sees those meadows, Noah bounding toward him. He knows one day, when God calls, he'll step into that vision, and Noah will be there, tail wagging, eyes bright, ready to run together without fear or pain, forever. Until then, he carries this message. Animals are God's instruments of love, entrusted to us to teach us loyalty, compassion, and the truth that love endures beyond the grave. Don't ignore the signs, he tells anyone who'll listen. They're all around us, in every faithful gaze, every quiet moment of trust. God sent Noah to me, and he's sending them to you too. His voice, once lost to grief, now rings with a clarity that draws others in, a testament to a bond that death couldn't sever, a love that points to the eternal.